Welcome, everybody. Welcome.
Welcome, everyone, to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series, hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're very thankful for all of you coming to join us today. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director here at the University of New Mexico in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. As a heads up for a couple of things today, if you have any questions for the presentation, please ask questions in the Q&A box anytime you feel comfortable. We will hold those off until the end. We try to get through as many as possible. Just forgive us if we can't get to yours. If you are pursuing continuing education credits and are on a tight schedule, you do have to stay for the hour, but don't have to stay longer than that. If we get to the top of the hour, I'll try to let you know when the hour is passed, and we may stay longer for additional questions for our presenter. For those of you that are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in in the chat box pretty shortly. For those pursuing APA continuing education credits, that link will come in about the last 5 minutes or so. And you need to open that link and save your certificate you need to open the link before you exit the talk and make sure you save your certificate from completing the survey, because we at LMH do not have access to those copies. A recording and the PowerPoint slides for this talk will be available within about a week. And as a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we'll have Dr. Kathleen Padilla, who'll be discussing a socio-ecological lens on police officer mental health and wellness. That's for next week, though. Now is the time that many of us have been waiting for. I would like to introduce you to today's speaker, who will be discussing anti-Blackness and the need for Black liberation ethics in forensic psychology. This is Dr. Evan Auguste. Dr. Auguste is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and a pre-licensed clinical psychologist. He completed his Ph.D. in clinical psychology with a focus in forensic psychology at Fordham University in 2022, and he's also a 2014 graduate of Middlebury College. Dr. Auguste's work focuses broadly on addressing the mental health consequences of structural anti-Blackness through the lens of Black liberation psychology. To this end, as part of his forensic training, he's done assessments and mental health work with incarcerated, asylum-seeking, and institutionalized populations. His lab's research involves community participatory, qualitative, and quantitative methods to examine the effects of disparate exposure to justice contact and community violence for Black adolescents and state-induced migratory traumas for Haitian people. His lab also focuses on developing and piloting anti-carceral and community-based health interventions, such as the Association of Black Psychologists Salbona Healing Circles, which Dr. Auguste co-developed, to promote healing from an African-centered framework. Evan, Dr. Auguste, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, can I just say how honored and excited we are to have you join our series, and thankful for you sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. I will now throw it over to you.
Oh, wow. This is a fantastic introduction. I appreciate that so deeply. And I'm honored. I'm honored to hold this space. I can see we have like a lot of people who joined. So to have that many people interested in these topics, I think is meaningful. I want to express, I believe a lot of people, especially after what was termed a racial awakening in 2020, took a lot of courses, read their anti-racist book, whatever that might have been. Maybe they had the book club. And what I hope this talk can do is build scaffold on that in a very specific way. Often when we talk about anti-racism, liberation, they seem like amorphous topics, amorphous conversations without material asks and material consequences. And so what I want to do with this talk is offer a specific way to understand, one, both the history of psychology, forensic psychology and its relationship to the state, how that's interacted with anti-Blackness, and how that continues today. And then based on that, how we can hope to move in service to, again, Black liberation. I do want to share also that the idea, the topic of Black liberation is one that has been developed not just by scholars, not just by academics, but real people. Right? It's an embodied politics. It's an embodied psychology that has been practiced by people for generations. And so when I offer my understanding of it, that is exactly what it is. It is my particular understanding. You could find a litany of brilliant individuals who could argue and make incredible cases for distinct ways of understanding and engaging with this work. So what I wanted this to do, again, is open the door for how to intersect and interweave this scholarship, this wisdom, this way of knowing into some of the work that is typically held within the domain of psychology. And so first and foremost, what this is going to require is, again, interweaving disciplines other than psychology. It's going to demand that we understand and leverage the disciplines of Black studies, disability studies, sociology, critical psychiatry, specifically Black psychology. We'll get into that as we move on, to understand the lay of the land. And so Terry Alice Pickens has a fantastic book, Black Madness, Mad Blackness, that, as you can see here, right, within the United States cultural zeitgeist, there is no Blackness without madness, nor madness without Blackness. This is a critical understanding because it shifts the way we think about the topic from purely understanding racism and Blackness like ableism, as if it's like the stigma against mental illness, and shifts it towards an understanding that these things have constituted one another. These things form one another, in fact. And so what do we do with the understanding as psychologists that historically our understandings of anti-Blackness, right, the collection of social pressures used to oppress Black people, directly inform and shape our understanding of mental illness and vice versa. So based on this, right, we understand that mental illness in its conception offered a tool for social control. Within Western, we're going to be focusing on specifically the US American context, right? This advanced white supremacist and capitalist systems. And we see this in, again, how early psychological theories are developed. You take a G. Stanley Hall, right? Everybody learns about a G. Stanley Hall in their introduction to psychology class. His understanding, right, of enslavement was that it was positive for the development of American society, that Black people, African peoples needed enslavement in order to balance, right, to balance their position in the United States. It was not only healthier, it made the country, the nation, safer for white peoples, to have a constant, consistent, vigilant eye. And he based this on his, again, psychological understanding of Black people as incapable of handling civilization. And we see this throughout a lot of early psychological theorists, right? Carl Jung believed African peoples to be devoid of coherent thought. When he took his trips throughout, I believe, either Western or Eastern Africa, what became his theory of collective unconscious was his view of African peoples, these peoples who did not have the civilized, coherent, collective consciousness that he's witnessed in Europe. And so his understanding of the collective unconscious was rooted in a theory, a system of thought that he could not comprehend. And so we see consistently through early psychological theories, not just that they're used as instruments to oppress Black people, but in fact, the very oppression shapes and forms how psychology is understood. A large one, again, is former president of the American Psychological Association, Robert Yerkes. I thought this was just a wild statement in a newspaper article. Argued that he believed guerrillas could be more fit to serve American society than Black people because of what he believed to be a higher IQ, a higher potential for guerrillas. And so based on these theories, we have diagnoses take shape. A lot of people are a bit familiar with drapetomania, right? Samuel Cartwright developed drapetomania to describe that uncontrollable urge that enslaved Africans had for freedom. Described this as an illness, a mental illness, because within psychology, it was understood that enslavement was a positive force for African peoples. It rendered society more simple for what they believed to be simple-minded individuals. And so the treatment, what does treatment look like? It looks like forced enslavement. It looks like plantation or institutional-based capture. We see this through various eugenics movements. It was described in the American Psychological Association's apology, how many of the former APA presidents engaged in eugenic societies, eugenic organizations, based on ideas of, again, general and immutable intellectual inferiority of Black people. And so what is treatment? Treatment is eugenics for the better of the state. Treatment is sterilization for the betterment of the predominantly white state. But this doesn't stop there, right? We see these kind of trends continue. You have the idea of a protest psychosis. Metzel talks about it in his book as this idea that not only were civil rights, Black nationalist protesters institutionalized and have this version of psychosis created to capture their political activity, the very nature of schizophrenia begins to shift based on the presentation within hospitals. We subtly watch the criteria for schizophrenia shift to more effectively, more efficiently capture the presentation of disproportionately Black men. And so we're seeing this consistent thought here. And what I want to note here, right, is that often when we talk about anti-racism in practice, we're talking about purely discrimination. But I think it's important here to note with particularly drapetomania and protest psychosis, we're also seeing the rendering Black political thought pathology. And so when we talk about Black anti-Blackness forming psychology, it's not purely those ideas of genetic inferiority, it's also pathologizing visions of the future, visions of health, visions of the self. Right? Those very ideas based in African senses of well-being are criminalized. And again, we see institutions built in response to this. So you have the Central Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane, the first state hospital for the forced institutionalization of Black people. We saw thousands of people institutionalized there for diagnoses like a drapetomania. You have the Ionia State Hospital for the criminally insane. We had a lot of people forcibly confined and definitely institutionalized for protest psychosis until it was closed in 1977. So these histories, right, these histories extend. But this is where the issue is. I was a part of an association of Black psychologists, a special interest group, implementation group that helped to form the Association of Black Psychologists' response to the American Psychological Association apology. Is when you look at these histories, they become distant. We become detached from them. When you frame narratives as progress, you lose sight of how these very conceptions inform and set the stage for where we are today. And so the ABPSI apology focused specifically on that, specifically on how these very frameworks, these very understandings, these very ways of interaction with Black people continue. They continue to frame our diagnoses. They continue to frame how we imagine health, how we imagine mental health, and how we imagine our responsibility. And within that, with that in mind, Frantz Fanon's conception that psychiatry as an auxiliary of the police is essential. We can have as many anti-racist trainings, as many journal articles, as many workshops as possible. But if you don't shift the relationship of the psychologist, the psychiatrist to the state, you're reproducing a lot of this harm that's been done. A lot of the times when people have conversations about abolition, about reforming police, the idea of mental health solutions, the idea of psychologists, social workers being involved comes to forefront. And luckily, again, you have people who will also push back saying, we also need to assess these professions. And what is their role in this? What has their role been in institutionalization? So a lot of this work extends from some of my collaborations with the Scholars for Elevating Equity and Diversity, SEED. We recently put out an article detailing this history as well as outlining a number of solutions. And within that article, we created this graph to demonstrate how these things reproduce. You look at the embedded racism, the embedded white supremacy, how that shapes our idea of criminalization, how that shapes our idea of mental illness, and how that gets enforced to create and recreate ideas of insanity that increase anti-Blackness, ideas of mental illness that make mental health institutions dangerous places for Black peoples. And unfortunately, because this captures our imaginations, it makes them more ineffective for people as a whole. And we can see that, I'm sure a number of people have seen that in their day-to-day practice and their day-to-day work. Right? When Black and white people present with similar symptoms, Black people are more likely to be diagnosed with psychotic disorders. When Black and white people present with similar psychotic symptoms, there is research evidence that demonstrates there's more support for police violence, police use of force against those people. And the inverse is true for white people. And also perceived psychosis is also used to explain the reason for the increased rate of institutionalization of Black people. So we're seeing here that the distinction in terms of outcomes doesn't lie in the symptomology, rather it lies in the perception of it. As was shared in the beginning, that Blackness and madness historically have formed one another, and we see that reproduce in society. Now this is fraught, We talk about consistently when it comes to the abolition of prisons. It's well known that these are dangerous places, but we tend not to turn that critical eye. I say tend not to. There are plenty. There are so many organizations who've made this their specific goal. The Institute for the Development of Human Arts, based in New York, has done a fantastic job of championing that, and there's a number of organizations who champion that. But in the broad public, what happens at psychiatric institutions tends to be rendered invisible. And World Health Organization in 2021 actually, again, pinpointed this, saying we need to look at the number of human rights abuses that happen within these psychiatric hospitals, within these forensic centers. I remember one of my first training experiences at a forensic center and having somebody say yeah, we get, people complaining about human rights abuses all the time. We can't do anything about that. And there's not that much of a critical look at that. And so I'll look at, what happened at Kirby Forensic Center, for instance, in 2020, saw the death of several patients because of, again, poor staff protocol. Now, the key there when it comes to, again, state death and state harm, we might imagine that, a lot of hospitals saw death because they were struggling with this new wave of pandemic, but it's about the oversight. It's about retribution. It's about what does justice look like in that sense? And often these people who are confined to these places are rendered invisible, they're rendered marginalized. And because of that, we have people like a Mayor Eric Adams, who that becomes his primary method of health in his eyes, is that institutional control. So it caused a media storm a few months ago where he called for the forced institutionalization of disproportionately Black unhoused people simply for living with mental illness. Had nothing to do with the perceived danger, the perceived threat. It was simply for existing while unhoused, living with mental illness. And so I want to bring us back, right? So I mentioned that understanding or engaging with this topic demands we engage with other disciplines. And so Cedric Robinson has a fantastic quote, and you can look at Christina Sharp, you can look at Joy James. I'm choosing to use Cedric Robinson. But the first forms of struggle in the Black radical tradition were not structured by critique of Western society, but from a rejection of European slavery and a revulsion of racism in its totality. Even then, the more fundamental impulse of Black resistance was the preservation of a particular social and historical consciousness, rather than the revolutionary transformation of feudal or merchant capitalist Europe. So this shifts. Right? This is a distinct approach to a Black liberation that's based in the histories, the first very practices of it. You'll note here, as he's articulating it, the Black radical tradition isn't about transforming these systems to make them more, a bit more safe. It's not about doing away with the disparate abuse. It's about imagining a world beyond. Like the Black radical tradition, these Black liberation ethics that I framed this presentation about, is about how do we, or rather, how does the state interact with those visions of the future, those visions of health that are based in the Black experience, that are based in a history of radical rejection of this capitalist European superstructure that people have been unfortunately cemented into. And so we know, like psychologically, and people have studied this, that there are benefits to Black identity, there are benefits to critical consciousness, there are benefits to resistance. It's historically been tied at the state level, right, internationally, to sustain positive systemic change, whether you're talking about the Haitian Revolution, whether you're talking about Gully Geechee, whether you're talking about George Floyd Square, right? Resistance based in the Black radical tradition has transformed spaces to help reimagine what it means to be human, what it means to be whole, and what our commitments are to one another. At the individual level, right, critical consciousness and resistance have been shown to be, again, common psychological responses by youth. It's a recreating type of consciousness that is based in this relationship of the Black experience in a particular type of state. You have people who engage in, again, sustained resistance, organized resistance, and you have people who have more embodied individual resistance. We also have evidence that the Black identity, as tied to, right, that understanding of history, has beneficial protective factors against the onslaught of racism. And I really want to also highlight this last point right here, is resistance looks like organized protest. Resistance looked like, right, individual declarations of dignity in the face of state violence, right? Perhaps not being respectful in response to an officer who is there to belittle or demean you is an act of resistance based in the Black radical tradition. So when we look at the state response then to this psychological imagining of a future at the adolescent level, what do we see? Right? We often see embodied individual resistance seen as a pathology in and of itself. We see punitive surveillance in school settings, in street settings. The Black psychologist Bobby Wright framed it as both of those being sites of kind of white supremacist surveillance. Like you're in the streets that tend to be owned by various private businesses, or you're in schools where I'm sure plenty of people have been on the workshop about the school to prison pipeline. We know that once that state contact is made, like the state contact in and of itself is predictive of future state contact. It's predictive of worsening mental health outcomes. And we know it's also led to the disproportionate application of these certain behavioral disorders, right, that root these issues, root these problems within the bodies of Black youth, rather than in the systems, in the larger context that they're forced to contend with. And Henning, in her book, I think it's called The Rage of Innocence, makes a great point about the denial of the category of adolescence, just point blank. And so based on this, we can see what is the state response to adult consciousness been like. Here's just a laundry list of examples of Black radical thinkers, scholars, activists. Right? You have Fred Hampton, who was educated by the scholar I mentioned, Bobby Wright, who was gunned down due to the COINTELPRO initiative by the FBI. He and his co-conspirator, Mark Clark, were gunned down in Chicago. Right? You have Mumia in Philadelphia. You have Assata Shakur, you have Angela Davis. We know, right, about the targeted state response to that Black consciousness, to that radical imagination of the future. That our psychological research has shown this is healthy, right? This is naturally occurring in response to state violence. And we've watched the state, right, thinking about how psychology is developed, we've watched the state pathologize that type of thought in and of itself. Because again, Blackness and madness produce and inform one another. And so I wanted to bring this to like today, where we are today when it comes to this, because this is systematic in nature. We have this idea of Black consciousness that's based in a vision, a future of the world, and we have a consistent state response to it. So you have the FBI marking Black identity extremism as a priority. This is informed, and again, a lot of these histories are intersectional, right? About how the response to MENA communities, Muslim communities following 9/11 informed how the FBI targeted Black identity extremists, or they turned Black identity extremists, right? Becomes a priority. We saw in 2020, Aronson has a fantastic journalistic project in which he revealed that the FBI embedded informants to stir up violence, to stir up chaos in racial justice movements, right? To try to encourage violence and otherwise peaceful protests. We watch at the level of the Movement for Black Lives put out a great report in which they did an assessment, and they found that at the level of I believe it was Donald Trump and Barr, made consequential decisions to federalize a lot of protest-related charges, to equip people with much more harsh sentences. At the local level, shout out to the journalism of Campbell, we also saw that these charges were also applied disproportionately towards Black protesters. So you can see, again, distinctly, as you move through it, the very idea of Black political resistance, that Black consciousness, that radical Black tradition becomes criminalized, becomes pathologized. We also saw, Derek Purnell has talked about this, that at various local movements, people reported the police, in fact, interrupting their alternative methods of community care, whether that be, I have a colleague who is an activist in Minnesota and reported, right, that people saw people being either pushed to or incentivized to create chaos in George Floyd Square so that the state could take back control over that area, where they created a beautiful mural, a beautiful vigil in honor of that. And the political scientist at Howard, Marcus Bohr Jr., has a fantastic model that he calls invisible weapons, in which he shares after all of this, right? After all of this targeted state disruption and criminalization, the public-facing elected officials will collect the collective grief, the collective stress, and guide it towards, as he understood it, like a more conservative vision for their future. He specifically looked at the protests around Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and how you saw a radical unity take place where people across gangs, people in various political divisions gathered around wanting state accountability for the harm they had experienced in Baltimore, and watched elected officials slowly kind of both attract and then push aside that political vision. Taking the demands for state accountability and making them demands for personal accountability. And so in this way, you see this consistent state response to subvert and to suppress the type of consciousness that wants to imagine society beyond what it is right now. Imagine health beyond what it is right now. And so I want to offer, again, a particular vision of what that looks like. This is Linda James Myers. She's a past president of the Association of Black Psychologists. And in her article, The Deep Structure of Culture, she talks about the way the African-centered system is structured. We are one with the source of all things good. The extent to which we entertain the dominant Eurocentric conceptual system, at best, aspects of that truth will be fragmented in our experience. The choice of conceptual system is ours. Power is the ability to define reality. And so I want to sit with that we have a vision of reality, a vision of society that is based in these Black radical traditions that is actively being suppressed. Linda James Myers is one of the most brilliant scholars in the field of African-centered and Black psychology. And so what she's talking about when she talks about an African-centered worldview is one that is informed by the various collective civilizations throughout Africa. Whether you're talking about Kemet, whether you're talking about the Zulu, whether you're talking about the Akan, all these wisdoms throughout the global South that within the field of psychology, as you'll recall, were deemed unworthy of thought or deemed incoherent in their structure. And saying, in fact, these systems of thought offer healthy ways of being. And in fact, as we discussed, you know that the state within the US has actively suppressed those visions. I want to remind that Bobby Wright was educated in this type of thought by, or Fred Hampton rather, was educated by Bobby Wright, a Black psychologist in this school of thought. And so what is Black psychology? And so Black psychology is this specific movement within the mid-20th century to recognize the psychological needs and strengths of Black people. So it's distinct. I've had this conversation with people. People often mistake it for kind of an ethnocentric version of psychology, a psychology specifically of Black people. But rather, and so in that case, like anybody who's Black doing psychology then is a practitioner of that. But Black psychology rather is a paradigm that has been extracted from this collective wealth and wisdom embodied in Black people over the generations. And so what does psychology look like when you look at the wisdom, the practices, healing among groups of people that historically psychology has said are incapable of thought, that were not integrated into our understandings of healing, into our understandings of society. And so because of this, the Black psychologist, as Kobe Cambon understands it, essentially has a political role, right? We see historically that this Black radical tradition has had visions for society, visions for how to create freedom, visions of liberation that have been suppressed. Within the conception of Black psychology, to create health, if our role as a psychologist is to create and encourage health, it demands a political dimension. It demands we shift the very structure of the state, especially a state that is actively suppressing this type of consciousness. Now, what I'm proposing isn't, again, I'm not proposing it. This is something that has existed in organizing, and legal frameworks since its inception. People are aware of critical race theory. Currently, there's a large attempt to suppress it in Florida, for instance. But critical race theory, as was shaped by the father of critical race theory, Derek Bell, was in part formed by some early conversations he had with Lyndon James Myers. As he understood the state, as he understood people within the state, he drew from Lyndon James Myers' theories of the deep structure of culture, or how African visions of community, African versions of collective wellness still existed within the context of the US. And that the overarching white supremacist structure in its conception and in its mission, right, was suppressing that. Ibram X. Kendi did a similar thing in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, where he cited not only Lyndon James Myers, but Wade Nobles, I believe Naim Akbar. So these visions of African-centered consciousness, these visions of the Black radical tradition have already informed many of the more popular legal frameworks. But as Bobby Wright termed it, the specific contention with the actual theory has been a rejected strand. Right? The material consequences, what it materially means to engage in a Black liberatory project with demands for reshaping the state tend not to be dealt with on the level of practice. I'll say in the modern day, right? I know Dr. Julius Garvey, son of Marcus Garvey, understands Black psychology as a natural extension of some of Marcus Garvey's work. And so what I want to focus on today briefly, and I would love to get to questions because that's what I was most excited about, is getting to talk a bit more about this in question, is what this has already looked like. Because what I'm discussing isn't, and I'm sure there's people here in attendance who know, like I'm talking about this, that they know somebody. They know somebody who this reminds them of. They know somebody who does this in practice. It tends not to get brought to the forefront. So you look at an Angela Davis, for instance. In forensic practice, Angela Davis and some of her consulting attorneys brought in some psychologists from the Bay Area Association of Black Psychologists to essentially prevent the opposing lawyers from stacking the jury against her. And so to do this, they assessed how the jurors felt about feminism, Black identity, communism, other socio-cultural values to shape that political process. Now, this process, again, of having psychologists consult on jury selection, it might not be like unfamiliar for people, but it's important to note the ethic. What is the underlying ethic there? The underlying ethic isn't to render the state more efficient. The underlying ethic is to ensure, right, the development of this Black consciousness that historically people have witnessed, have experienced as healthy. It's not to, again, optimize the state. It's to help people imagine a version of themselves beyond and past the state. Another fantastic example of this is the work going on right now with the California Task Force to study reparations. It's co-led by Black psychologist Cheryl Grills. And again, it's one of the more landmark developments we've seen in the fight for reparations. Reparations being forcing the state to contend with the history of harm. We documented already like several instances. You need several classes to document this in each state. The fight for reparations is forcing the state to contend with that and materially concede the type of support necessary to allow people to flourish. Dr. Cheryl Grills guided the development of this, and Saw testimony from several mental health professionals, including Theopia Jackson, Sean Uchi, Howard Stevenson, Joy DeGruy, Christy Higgins, and also Enola Aird, who, while is not a mental health professional, has overseen the Community Healing Network for a number of years. So what the entire presentation about is about building on this tradition, right? Building on the activists, building on the radical scholars who've been guided by a vision of collective unity, of wellness, of health that exists beyond our current relationship to the state. There are people in various fields. I've mentioned a few scholars. You could talk about the theories of Frank Wilderson and Afro-pessimism. You could talk about the work of Amos Wilson. You could talk about the work of Sadia Hartman. You could talk about Lorgia Pena Garcia extending a lot of this work transnationally to how Black people exist in distinct states. So the essential piece here, right, is when you talk about an ethic based on Black liberation psychology, it extends our commitments as psychologists, as healers, as people, to beyond optimizing the state, or trying to make the state more fair. It's about materially transforming past the state. It asks questions, right? What does it mean to liberate within a decolonial project? Because our job here isn't to make the United States more, or make Black people in the United States more effective settlers of indigenous land. You have scholars within Black studies, within indigenous studies, who are investigating this specific question. And these are the types of questions that we, as forensic professionals, need to be engaged in, need to be uplifting, need to be in service towards. So that's my little piece. So I'd love to get into some questions. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share just a bit of some of these, some of the work that's been going on around this.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Auguste. And indeed, I do see some of the questions starting to trickle in here. For those of you that want to ask questions, again, it'll be in the Q&A box there. I will throw some to your way. This person asks, in what ways can a Black liberation psychology view be applied to how BIPOC individuals are evaluated in the criminal justice system by non-Black psychologists and evaluators in particular?
Okay, so asking, this is by Jocelyn, right? In what ways could a Black liberation view apply to how BIPOC individuals are evaluated in the criminal? Exactly, right? So I understand this as a question on two levels. One is reminding, right, that within the context of Black liberation psychology, it's about first dimension, right? It's transforming that very dynamic, right? It's imagining distinct, different ways of that dynamic. So how can we envision a more authentic, fair process of justice? Because what goes on right now, the criminal justice system is not that. So again, it's not about necessarily optimizing that process. But again, it's political, it's instrumental, it's strategic. And so I also hear you asking, how can we maintain safety for these people within a system that we know is, that does a lot of harm? And so what I've seen, right? So what I've seen people do, because again, these are not new ideas. I've seen people bring in new measures. They bring in new assessments. They engage in the scholarship, again, of Black studies, of history. One of my colleagues, Tania Lodge, has done this in Akron, Ohio for a number of years as a forensic psychologist, is introducing measures based in African-centered psychology, debating the efficacy of how state conceives individuals to do exactly this, right? To more accurately and appropriately evaluate those people who come before the state. Long-winded answer. I'm a long-winded person. I apologize about that.
Not at all. Thorough, right? Yeah. Somebody asked a little bit earlier during the presentation and said that sometimes your comments referred to are about Black people and other times are about Black men, and was curious if whether this was intentional.
Yes. So yes, right. Like I mentioned, this is just a pinch, and I wanted to be specific when these systems were being formed in a gendered racial dynamic, and when they were being formed in a more broad racially oppressive dynamic. Kind of drawing from some of the idea of intersectional invisibility, right? That as a lot of these forces were conceived, Black women tended to be erased within an overall like patriarchal society. But that's again not to mean that Black women haven't been targeted. I referenced the work of Marcus Board Jr., who did this exact work from a Black feminist framework and examined how the state responds specifically to a Black woman deemed mad by police. Again, her entire political vision for her future erased after the police assassinated her. So I just wanted to be specific, and I could give a whole thing specifically about the nature of how this has shaped Black women, Black queer folk across the board.
Wonderful. We have one question here. There's a little bit of a setup here. So it says, interesting material. I do find myself wondering, however, how to apply to forensic psychology work. For instance, you make the case where concepts of mental illness are unfairly used when applied to Black individuals. But many people see the not guilty by reason of insanity as a more fair entity when someone's facing legal charges. So when it comes to not guilty by reason of insanity, how do we incorporate the need to be more conservative when applying diagnoses, while also considering that applying these mental health diagnoses can allow someone to potentially be treated more fairly by the legal system?
And so this is, I want to return briefly, right? So this is part of the issue, right? Is that when you're talking about a Black liberation ethic, the overall goal, and I understand in the same way the first one did, right? It's about, I'll offer to the person we're talking about the level of strategy. So this is a question on the path to transforming that very system, because I would also state, right, what's been framed as the more fair option often still has a lot of negative consequences, a lot of harmful consequences for people. And so the specific question was how to apply this in that context, right? How to, and so that first thing I want to make, I believe as forensic psychologists, we have to make that that landscape clear, right? Is that often we're forced to choose between literally the rock and the hard place. Like the way that our system has been constructed is often very violent towards our most vulnerable people. And people have spent times in some of these forensic centers, like they know that intimately. And so what does safety look like in that specific context? What I find myself pushing towards is, again, like advocacy, right? It looks like, how could we, based on like our individual experiences, advocate for, co-construct new systems of health well-being, new options that exist outside the narrow systematic processes that don't create health. They create control. Right? So that's what I would say to that.
Related to this this line of advocacy, somebody just asked if you have any thoughts for clinicians about how to balance opportunity to advocate for these ideas to attorneys and courts with the principle that we are supposed to be, quote unquote, objective in forming our opinions.
Yeah, and I like that you said quote unquote, because Anthony, I know a lot of your work has cast a lot of that into doubt. And so again, I believe, and it's essential for people to understand that often in these cases, we're supposed to be quote unquote objective, but what we find ourselves doing is kind of refining our subjectivities. And so deepening, again, your understanding, introducing these histories, introducing these disciplines into our understanding of psychology. I think often we see ourselves as being shaped by a state mandate without any understanding of how historically and currently the field is also done vice versa, like shape those very questions, shape the very nature of the problems we're presented with. And so that's what I would say, right? Is as people become more informed about Black studies, Black psychology, integrate more of these frameworks into their assessments, their demands, their understandings of the people that sit before them, how they interrogate those questions in a courtroom, those change. Those are required to change, and we've seen them change.
Somewhat related, though, I think it's a different word, so I think it's worth emphasizing here as opposed to advocate. Can you speak to the role of psychologists as activists with respect to racism and anti-Blackness specifically?
Yeah, I see it as, and through the discipline of Black psychology, it's a requirement. You can get the Association of Black Psychologists has a certification program, and part of that is right about community activism, community work. The way that often looks like I'm not speaking theoretically, I'm thinking about it materially. Right? I think about a Dr. Bobby Wright, for instance, who in Chicago leveraged his knowledge to create a free community university, who trained the local branch of the Black Panthers there, including Fred Hampton, who created public Black community centers to treat mental health. I don't want to be like flippant. It's more than about like often like right tweeting or voting in the right direction, but using the privilege that, because we do have a privilege with this title in society to co-create alternative systems. Right? And so it demands us do more than write about it. It demands we do more than just teach about it. It demands that we build. Like, are you in community with people who are doing that work? Because there are people doing that work. This is not ephemeral. This is going on the ground. And so finding out in your location, like wherever you are, who are those people doing that work? How could I be of support? How could I be of use in that context?
Can you talk more about the measures that are rooted in Black psychology?
Man, there's so many. Be a whole class. There's the cultural worldview scale that's come out of Ohio. There's Afrocultural coping that's come out of, I believe, Sean Utsi, Mark Bowden. There's the cultural misorientation scale that's based on a particular conception of African worldview that's come out of Kobe Cambone's work at FAMU. So the question is much more expansive, because again, this is an entire field of inquiry that's been going on for over 50 years. There's been an assortment of scales. Now the very work of assessing where's optimal to use it in a forensic context, that's burgeoning. Right? People have done that in certain contexts because their commitments were towards more practice than scholarship. They did not like write about it. So I'll say that's like a growing area.
I see we have a couple of questions that seem to get on communication and extending this further. So I'll ask a couple of these here. How do you propose we address colleagues who purport competence in forensics without having an understanding or application of Black liberation psychology?
Without having an under.
We had a brief connection issue there?
Was it me, or was I don't know. I think I just got the thing my connection was unstable. But
okay. I can ask the question again.
Was it from Tamandra? Sam?
Yes.
Let me just read through it. How do you propose we address colleagues who purport competence in forensics without having an understanding or appreciation of Black liberation psychology? how do we propose to address college report? I'm thinking about this two ways. One, again, I think it's about like the principle of it, right? How would you address a colleague that you thought was, engaging in their practice unethically? I think you do so while at the same time knowing that a lot of this material, again, I didn't learn in my training program. A lot of, I would say almost, in fact, everything I presented on, I learned from deep conversation with people outside of the academy. And so if people are authentically interested, it's, offering those places of education, maybe having those conversations, introducing them to the Journal of Black Psychology, the number of works. The Association of Black Psychologists has plenty of regular available workshops. They have Creating Zola Mondays every Monday, in which or every first and third Monday, in which they engage with a different scholar in the field of Black psychology. So there's plenty of ways and plenty of scholarship to engage somebody to present that material. But again, what you're talking about is like most people don't have, right, that confidence. And so in my life, it's just like having those conversations, introducing that as a method of practice and building from that.
Excellent. And the one directly below that, tips on how to integrate this into our everyday work that bring to the forefront for our coworkers in a way that's relatable and digestible, especially for those who are non-African American.
Yeah, so it's a tough project. I referenced at the beginning the 2020 racial awakening, in which I'm sure everybody has that friend who read a book, and that was it. Maybe they got to 2 books, but it's a sustained practice. One of my what we call in the Association of Black Psychologists, we call them JEGNAs. Wade Nobles said you almost have to learn earn 2 degrees to do the work. Right, you have to get your traditional psychology degree so you can get all the letters necessary to do the work, but then also you have to go back and research all the histories, right? All the scholarship that tends not to be presented in the university. So there's no, again, like quick tip where you could offer somebody a one article and they'd be good. It has to be a sustained practice. It has to be a sustained ethic. It has to be, right, engaging with the material, engaging with the contradictions, right? I'm under no illusion that what I presented is an uncontroversial viewing of this material, right? There are people who could take a radical, brilliant, like a womanist perspective and present the material as strong, if not significantly better, right? And so it requires like really swimming in the water that's been stirring for decades to do this. And I gave this presentation. I could tell you, you offered this again next year, the presentation will look very different because I'm constantly evolving. There are probably people here who have distinct understanding of this, who wanted me to touch on something a little bit different or radically different. And they're just as true, if not more true, in their understanding of the material.
Certainly, and there are a number of questions, of course, that's continual to come in. I'll throw one more out. By all means, if you see another one that you want to answer to as well, you certainly can. That any words of advice to Black psychologists who find themselves tired with trying to implement these ideas and integrate these fields that were not designed with our presence at the table?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the words of another one of my jugnas named Mark Bolden, and he said like, is the, what did he say? He said like, are we necessarily like winning this struggle? He's like, maybe not necessarily, because we could see all the harms going on around the world, in the US specifically. He said, is it worth doing? He's like, obviously, because this is why you're called to do this work. I think about it materially, is knowing that there are a lot of spaces that have been developed. I'm going to keep drawing from the Association of Black Psychologists, but also the community healing networks in terms of these healing circles that exist specifically for Black people experiencing that stress. The Salbona healing circles run, I believe there's 4 or 5 really available circles for Black people experiencing this type of racial fatigue, this racial stress, available to anybody like experiencing that anti-Black distress. So taking advantage of those spaces. 2 is recognizing what I deeply struggle with, but recognizing this work is being done in community. And so we could feel called to do this work. A lot of our ancestors, the people that we look up to, whoever they might be, right? We know they did this work, they made this work their passion. And also balancing the fact that a lot of people that we look up to didn't get to live full lives. Some of them because they were assassinated, some of them because their health gave out on them. And so it's recognizing that the work is necessary and needed, and at the same time to do this work over a sustained period of time. When you feel that stress, when you feel that pain, when you feel that fatigue, it's resting. Right? Taking the steps back you need to take to step back, and trusting that there are other people in community that are doing the work. I don't know you, but if, again, I feel that way, I'm comfortable taking my week, 2 week, 3 weeks, knowing that you're out there doing that. And when you feel that, you can trust that me, some of the people I know are gonna step up. And so moving in community like that.
Dr. Auguste, Evan, can I just say again, it's a thrilled to have you here. Thank you for sharing your expertise as well as the work that you're doing outside of here in clinical work and in education. You can see here that we've been inundated with where can I get more info? Where can I read more info? I'll also throw out there for anybody that's attending the American Psychology Law Society conference next week. You can also see Dr. Auguste talk about more of his work there. And so go check out the program and see him there. That is a wrap up for this week's Law and Mental Health series. Again, next week we'll have Dr. Kathleen Padilla, who will be talking about law enforcement, mental health wellness from a socio-ecological perspective. Have a fantastic week, and we will see you again.